I've no doubt that we'll get organizational change and a system which is fit for purpose. The only thing I have total doubt about, which I don't know, is whether we're in the First World War or the Second World War. Whether we have to be thrown off a cliff again, or whether the pandemic was enough of a wake-up call to get the shift. And I hope desperately, and that's why I wrote the book, that, you know, we all know people that have suffered desperately. Some of us know people that have died. Many of us know people with long COVID. You don't want all that suffering to be in vain. If we can do anything to ensure it doesn't occur again, that this is the wake-up call that humanity needed to shift gears, then I think the onus is on us to do it. Thanks very much, Tamsin, and thanks to Amiga, Impact Trust, and all the other networks that are involved in this webinar, doing great work to raise awareness about risk, resilience, and what to do. I thought what would be useful, just to provoke a conversation, is talk a little bit about what I've been arguing in Rescue, why I saw the pandemic as inevitable, why I've been predicting it, and how that relates to this very complex moment we're in now, and then what's next. For me, we're in this period of hyper complexity, a global dynamic complex system, and that really has arisen more rapidly with many more nodes and networks in the period post 1989, which for me is sort of the periodization of this period of globalization, by which I mean flows across national borders of goods, of services, of investment, of digital traffic, of people, but most significantly of ideas, and good and bad flows. And clearly what we're seeing is all of that, the good, the bad, and the ugly of globalization emerging. The sort of naive enthusiasm that many of us had in the 90s, that this was only a spreader of goods, I think has been seriously now disrupted by what we're seeing. And we recognize that unless we manage the underbelly of globalization, what I call the butterfly defect of globalization, we cannot sustain it. And we will not sustain the progress that's been made. The reason I care about this is because I think more progress has been made more quickly by more people over this period of about 33 years since the late 80s than at any time in history. So it really matters on virtually any dimension you look at. Certainly poverty reduction, life expectancy, the number of people that are educated, gender equity, human rights, respect for diversity, including, of course, gay rights. All of these dimensions have changed immeasurably over the last 33 years. And that's really the time since the fall of the Berlin Wall, the opening up of China, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the development of the Maastricht Treaty and integrated Europe without borders within Europe, NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement, Uruguay round of trade negotiations, capital account liberalizations, and of course, crucially, in 1990, the development of the World Wide Web. It's that which has led to this turbocharged spreading of ideas, spreading of possibilities, which has led to, amongst other things, this extraordinary progress in poverty reduction. But what we've seen, and we were rudely awakened to through, I think, the financial crisis, and then again dramatically now through the pandemic, and of course through growing evidence around climate change and other systemic risks, is that this process of integration requires management. And the big disconnect is between the system, which is hyper-integrated and dynamic, and the management, which remains Westphalian, primitive, fragmented, national, except with the remarkable exception of the European Union. where countries have voluntarily given up sovereignty in really key dimensions, including migration, justice, defense, foreign policy, monetary policy, fiscal policy, etc., in a very significant degree to the European Commission. So it's an interesting experiment, is can countries give up sovereignty? And the obvious answer is they have, to some extent. But the queue of countries joining, wanting to join, is much greater than the idiots that led Brexit and led to the withdrawal from that. And I'm happy to have a conversation on that if any participant is wanting to do so. The financial crisis was the wake-up call, because finance is the best governed of the international systems. If you compare the IMF or the World Bank to other global institutions, they're much more powerful, they have much better qualified people, they pay them more, and they have a lot of data. And the same is true at the national level. If you compare our treasuries or finance ministries and central banks to other parts of our governments, one gets a sense that they are in a different league in terms of their power, their capacity, and they attract the best talent who they are able to pay for that. So why is it that 70,000 PhDs around the world, whose job it is to ensure financial stability, didn't see the financial crisis coming? And I was certainly one of them, because I was head of policy for the World Bank Group and vice president in the run-up to the global financial crisis. And the answer is partly that we didn't understand technological change. We didn't understand what the kids were doing with credit derivatives. The elder, often white men like me, just didn't have the skill set or the knowledge required to understand the technological progress. And the second was an assumption that basically this thing could be managed nationally through national policies, when what we were in was an increasingly integrated dynamic system. So no one actually had the data set, even the IMF and others didn't, because they were looking at the national data, not the trans-border or aggregate gross and net flows at the global level in the right ways. We know what the consequence of the global financial crisis was, which was a dramatic collapse in trust in governments, in the elite to manage, which is not surprising. A sense that it was unfair. No bankers went to jail, and inequality soared following the financial crisis. And the political consequences were widely felt. I don't believe that we would have had Trump in the White House or Brexit in Britain, or the rise of extreme parties across Europe, had it not been for the financial crisis. So these economic events have real consequences, in the same way that the fall of the Berlin Wall led to a ripple around the world that led to 50 countries becoming democratic, and human rights and other rights being established around the world, including in Tamsin and my country, South Africa. And I was in exile. I never thought I would ever go back to South Africa in my lifetime. Within 2 months of the Berlin Wall coming down, Nelson Mandela was released from the prisons that he'd spent 27 years in. And he came to Paris 6 months later and invited me to go back and be his economic advisor. That's the upside of globalization, that global ripple of change. And we see it in other and more recent events. We see it in the Me Too movement being created by a tweet. We see it in Greta Thunberg starting a Friday's movement on climate action by standing outside her classroom. We see the upside, 42 countries legalizing gay marriage. That's why it's important to understand that this is a dual-edged sword. The pandemic is the second, following the financial crisis, of the big wake-up calls about the failure to manage globalization. And in a sense, it's even more frustrating than the global financial crisis, because it was absolutely inevitable. And any zoologist or person that is involved in the field would have said that. And the intelligence agencies that publish their risk matrices show pandemic risk being right up in the top right-hand quadrant of risk and probability. And yet we devote, as countries and as a global system, less than 1,000th of what we devote to military preparedness, to pandemic preparedness. One battleship has a budget bigger than the WHO. One hospital group, big hospital group, has a budget that's bigger than the WHO. And it's that disconnect between the risks we face and our focus on them and the organization at the national and global level, which is my biggest concern. The pandemic propelled us into the future in a dramatic way. It compressed into a 2-year period, I think, things that would have evolved over 10 or 20 years and may not even have evolved, like the dramatic shift to remote work. Telework's been around for a long time. It required that structural disequilibrium to force a positional change on that. It also enabled us to see very clearly that many of the things that we thought were absolutely essential aren't. Governments did in March and April 2020 what they would have said was absolutely impossible in January 2020. Printing money, paying workers not to go to work, paying firms not to go bankrupt, taking over all sorts of parts of the economy. And we as individuals did the same. We changed our behavior in ways which would have been unimaginable prior to the pandemic. If you had told us that we couldn't hug our children, we couldn't go to the movies, we couldn't take a plane, etc., we would have rejected that as unacceptable authoritarianism. But we embraced it because we saw it was in the societal interest. And so the question now is, what's next? Is that a structural shift, or are we just going to revert? And what scares me most is the language of bounce back or bounce forward, because the road we're on is the road we have to get off. Bouncing back or forward implies we carry on along the same path that we've been on. That's the path leading us over the precipice. That's the path that inevitably will lead us to the next pandemic, which could be much more severe. That will lead us to escalating climate catastrophe, growing inequality. That means growing extremism and populism and nationalism within our countries, and a very dystopian future. A future characterized by more crises, therefore more insecurity, more unemployment, more of the sorts of things we're seeing now, which is likely to lead to another debt crisis. And with that, a retreat to populism. Other language, even the Biden-Harris language of build back better, I don't like, because when you build back better on fundamentally flawed foundations, you will collapse again, certainly. And of course, the World Economic Forum's slogan or sort of vision, the Great Reset, is equally disturbing. Because if we reset our computers, we go back to the operating systems that were already there. And so when I hear the word reset, I think that's the last thing we want, just to go back to the operating system pre-pandemic. So what do we need and how do we get there becomes the question. And how do we do it, particularly at this time, which is very, very difficult in terms of people experiencing real hardship. My big takeaways from this is that we certainly can stop pandemics, and we can reduce or not remove clearly the risks posed by other global threats like climate and others. The question really is, are we in the First World War or the Second World War? And as you all know, those were extremely ghastly wars, and the First World War was meant to be the war, as H.G. Wells said, to end all wars. But it was followed not only by the pandemic of 1918, not a Spanish pandemic, a Texan pandemic, which the Spaniards were saddled with the name of because they named it. But terrible economic policies, a roaring 20s, which I fear we almost are likely to repeat a century later, rapidly rising global inequality, a blame game, and which we certainly in between the US and China at the moment. And what followed was, of course, rising nationalism, protectionism, a debt crisis, and an even worse war. But in the midst of that war, literally while the bombs were dropping on Whitehall, Churchill, Roosevelt, who had experienced the First World War and knew that this was a repeat game, decided that they needed a very different world order. And so they commissioned a Beveridge report, or Churchill did, which led to the creation of the welfare state. And of course, the United Nations, the Bretton Woods institutions, the Marshall Plan, instead of forcing reparations, giving money after the war, very large amounts of it, like over 1% of US GDP, to Germany and Japan. That's why we have the Germany and Japan we have today. It was that decision which was so fundamental, that allowed people to go off and sacrifice their lives because they believed things would be different. And very large numbers of people do. In my college in Oxford, Balliol, outside the chapel, is the list of people that sacrificed their lives in the First and Second World War. And what you see there is over a third of the class died. But they felt it was worthwhile, or the parents did, because the society was different and they were fighting for something different to a repeat game. Churchill, of course, was deposed from office 6 weeks after the end of the war. And you can just imagine how much of a war hero he was, having won that war. But he was deposed because he wasn't prepared to embrace the fullness of the radical changes necessary by the biggest landslide victory Labour's ever known, led by a relatively bland leader that makes our current Labour leader, Keir Starmer, seem rather charismatic. So the lesson of that is that people were basically, in South African terms, gatvol. They were sick and tired of this, and so they wanted something different. The danger we're in now is that that's been driven towards populist extremes, partly because the social media didn't exist then. There wasn't that option, and because people had seen close hand what authoritarianism in the form of Hitler looked like, and so were repulsed by extremism at that point. The question now is, are we able to find a new path? And how do we build on the lessons of all of this? And the great news is that there's so many more actors now. There's cities, there's companies, there's states, their networks, none of which existed in the way that we know them today in previous periods of great change. And so the possibilities of change and of people connecting, and our knowledge of what needs to be done and what the problems are, whether it's pandemics or climate change or antimicrobial resistance or financial management, are so much greater, as is our knowledge of what works to overcome inequality, for example. So we're armed with extraordinary potential of information, of networks, of capacity. And yet, it seems like despite all this progress, we're in a political structure system where the global system is totally unfit for 21st century purpose. That's the UN, and I would argue even the Bretton Woods institutions, etc., are unfit for purpose. They have not evolved since the Second World War. And crucially, our nation states seem to be going backwards. We have more of them, which makes resolution more complicated, and there seems to be a retreat towards nationalism and protectionism. We look at this in lots of different dimensions. So that this is a crucial time. It's a crucial time for individuals who understand these things to learn more, to network, to get together, and to find new solutions to problems. If we don't, of course, then we have a very worrying downside. The upside potential is enormous in terms of progress, quite remarkable. But the downside risks are equally precipitous. And so it's a crucial time for thought leadership, for leadership of all types, and most of all for action and coming together of people, which is why I embrace the spirit of participating in this webinar.
Thank you, Ian. Michael, I'm going to hand over to you.
Yes, Townsend, thank you very much. And Ian, I'm so grateful. I've been able to hear your entire presentation. My computer kept me from signing on into one of the most important conversations we've had. So I'm going to have to ask Tamsin and Stanley to monitor the questions online. Can you all hear me adequately? Yeah. Ian, we've been engaged with exploration of the poly crisis intensively for the past 4 or 5 years. I think you probably know our colleague Peter Goldmark, who ran the Rockefeller Foundation and so on. Peter has often reminded us that what we need above all is to imagine the institutions that we need globally for the 21st century. And I have to say that your book, Rescue from a Global Crisis to a Better World, is perhaps the most compelling example that I have seen of a comprehensive effort to imagine the institutions we need for the 21st century. And so let me start with this question. You led the South African Development Bank, I'm not sure I have the exact title correct, out of being an apartheid institution into a institution that not only supported South Africa, but worked broadly beyond that. My first question is, did you learn lessons from that effort that have informed all of your subsequent efforts to develop this global field in which you're playing such a critical role?
Yeah, thanks very much, Michael, and it's a pleasure to engage with you. That's an interesting question that I haven't been asked for a very long time. The Development Bank of Southern Africa, for those of you that didn't know it, originally had been an apartheid-era institution funding the sort of apartheid vision of different homelands in South Africa, and then I transformed it under Nelson Mandela's guidance to be an instrument for development across the 14 countries of the SADC region, but we ended up, by the time I left, actually funding projects in Ghana and many other parts of Africa as well. And very actively so. I mean, connecting over 5 million people a year to water and to many other services, as well as doing the first public-private partnerships in the region. I certainly learned a lot of lessons. I mean, the first lesson I learned, I think, it was a baptism of fire in many respects. I never actually run anything nearly comparable to this. So it was an act of faith in me that wasn't based on my CV at all, that I got the job. But the first thing I learned was that one needed to spend a lot of time listening and learning. So I was in a world that was very foreign to the world I knew, and I spent the first 6 months just not only listening to people in the bank in South Africa, what their vision was in the region, but also globally. And in that respect, the person that was perhaps most helpful was Jacques de la Rosière, who at the time was the president of the European Bank for Reconstruction Development, who gave me everything from the EBRD, all the operational manuals, gave me his chief advisor to help me in terms of setting up the treasury and the risk management and the other functions of the bank. The other thing that was really crucial is that it was a tough time to turn an apartheid institution into a democratic one. And included in the staff of the bank were over 200 people who I felt needed to leave because they were very much part of the past. In South Africa, everyone has guns, and so it wasn't a good time. I had on the right people who really didn't like what I was doing, and on the left, I had a lot of people who felt that I was wrong, that a white guy was being appointed to lead this institution, and there was a whole Pan-Africanist and radical Black Africanist agenda, which also didn't like. And then there were also trade unions of all varieties. Learning to work with them was vital. And I guess the one thing that really mattered to me is that I respected my boss, that was Nelson Mandela, and he gave me absolutely unequivocal support. And when he sensed that people were from the right and left were going for me, he just basically issued a message and said, "I've appointed Ian. Anything that Ian does is what I believe in. You mess with him, you mess with me, basically." And that was essential for me. If your boss doesn't support you, and if people sense that you're weak, I think you can't institute big systemic change. And so I learned a lot about that.
That's a great response.
And my one takeaway from it, one of my takeaways is never work for someone you don't respect. And I've been very fortunate in all my jobs. When I was at the World Bank, I went to the World Bank from there. Jim Wolfenson, I never accepted a cent from Jim Wolf. The World Bank was very frustrated because it never lent any money to South Africa. I was in charge of the negotiation as well with the World Bank, and I didn't like their terms. And then Jim Wolfenson said, "When you step down, come and help me reform the World Bank," which I did. And when Jim was replaced by Paul Wolfowitz, who of course had been one of the architects of the Iraq War, that's when I left the World Bank, because I did not respect, and I still do not respect, Paul Wolfowitz.
I don't think we've had anybody in the excellent conversations we've had with the level of expertise in hands-on management of global institutions that you have. When I look at, I so commend your book, Rescue, to everyone, but if we look at the contents and just how you've laid it out, the first part one is about inequality, reducing inequality, solidarity of young and old, overcoming global poverty, and work for all. That's pretty straightforward. The second part is intervention from hands off to hands on. Economies for shared prosperity, better business, governments that serve, cities for the future, and then very unusually, improving mental health. Now, I'll just star that because it's not one would expect here. Then part three, cooperation while working together brings shared prosperity, politics and power shifts, inclusive globalization, responding to the climate emergency, and stopping global crises. Now, when you get to stopping global crises, you point out that that at Davos, nobody expected when they made the list in January 2020, when COVID was already spreading, the World Economic Forum's Global Risk Report 2020 did not include a global pandemic in the top 10 most likely risks identified. And then you say the failure of the forum to predict crises predicts a much wider problem. None of the global organizations that produce risk rankings saw the pandemics as a likely threat. So then you go on to talk about how risk experts involved with groupthink rarely see these things. And so interesting, you have been sounding the alarm about pandemics in your book, The Butterfly Defect, and in the Age of Discovery, Navigating the Storms of Our Second Renaissance. So you really not only lean into the need to deeply reform global institutions, but you address specifically the issue we're focused on, which is the global polycrisis and the interaction of environmental, social, technological, financial, economic stressors acting with increasing force unpredictably. So two separate questions. One is, how did mental health so unexpectedly and so interestingly make it up to the top of your outline? And secondly, when we look at the polycrisis, as you well know, it's not any one of these crises, it's the constant accelerating interactive force. Two very separate questions. How did mental health get there? And how do you see the interactive power of the polycrisis being addressed by the global reforms you recommend?
Yeah. Two very perceptive questions. There are two reasons why mental health are there. The first is I was picking, I'm a professor at Oxford, and so I was picking up from students, from data coming out of the university, but also from a lot of the research I was looking at, some of which is cited there. What a disaster the pandemic was for mental health. The isolation of young people, the closure of facilities in the US, something like a third of mental health capacity went offline, either physically or in other ways. And the permanent scarring that this was having. So that was sort of, I was picking up, but the other thing I was picking up 24/7 was that my wife's a psychotherapist. So she, you know, I pick up her stuff and she tells me about stuff, and she's never been busier than during the pandemic, and with really startling things going on in terms of people's levels of depression, suicide risk, etc. And I guess it reflects what's happening in my home as well as in my work. That leads to that chapter. My brother-in-law is a psychiatrist as well, and I was picking up from him as well. They all read that chapter to check it was okay, because I'm way out of my depth talking about mental health. The poly crisis, yes, I think this is absolutely the case. These crises feed off each other, and it's this vicious circle. So we have the financial crisis leading to obviously greater inequality, and incidentally, the response to the financial crisis, which is a stimulus package which involves cement and concrete infrastructure, accelerating carbon emissions, accelerating that, growing inequality leading to more protectionism and nationalism, less cohesive global politics, a rising blame game with China, and a rising incapacity, therefore, to coordinate on stopping crises, including through fighting in the WHO board, which made the probability of not managing this pandemic greater, as well as tensions with China, which made this the probability of managing the pandemic worse. And then you get the pandemic, and it accelerates, and now we have Russia's invasion of Ukraine, thinking that everyone's distracted, thinking this is an opportune moment. Of course, Russia in its own crises as well, and these all feeding each other, and it doesn't. You have to stop the circle. And I think what I'm increasingly seeing as the bottom line of the problem is inequality, which is why it's the first chapter in Rescue. What all crises do is they particularly penalize poor people in poor countries. That means inequality gets worse within countries and between countries. I mean, Africa has been particularly devastated by the pandemic, and now again by the food and energy crisis. And we're about to enter a debt crisis because the US lifting interest rates, the last time that happened, which was Volcker in the 1980s, following the Yom Kippur War, the Iran-Iraq War, etc., we had a global debt crisis. We're going to have the same again. Unless one allows people to feel that they can be better off by cooperating, and that there's something in it, you get this anger, and social media certainly fanning it. It's added fuel to the poly-crisis fires by pushing people to extreme solutions on the right and the left. What they all have in common, and even the mainstream has in common, in other words, the Democrats and the Republicans in the US, is increasing nationalism and protectionism. There's no crisis, let alone a poly-crisis, that can be resolved without the US and China being in the room together. And so my biggest concern, and I never thought I would say this in my lifetime, my biggest concern is I don't see a Kissinger in the White House. I don't see anyone that gets it, that although we really don't like these people, we have to work with them. That's what Kissinger did. And he changed the course of US history for the better, and Chinese history for the better by engaging in that conversation. And the danger is now in this downward spiral we're in between the US and China particularly, that you cannot resolve a poly crisis if the two global powers can't talk to each other about it. And that's, I think, the greatest threat that we face. But you're absolutely right. It doesn't really matter which crisis you solve. If you can stop pandemics, you'll also stop climate change escalating, because you would have learned to cooperate. If you can, and the two are unusual. You know, finance is very different, because actually you could put 7 countries in the room and about 12 banks, and you could stop financial crises. The same is true of antimicrobial resistance. New York State produces more antibiotics than the whole of 43 countries in sub-Saharan. Pandemics are unusual because they require everywhere on earth to be part of the solution. Come from the poorest country, the poorest place, or the richest lab in the richest country. And increasingly, that's the risk with genomics. And climate is the same. Although it's a very small number of actors that cause the problem, 12 countries accounting for 80% of emissions, 500 companies, 80% of emissions. The impact is everywhere. And so I think those are, thinking about those and working out how to stop them. And increasingly, it's going to have to be non-state actors. But there's no solution to either crisis without the China and US resolving. So the biggest question in my mind is, how do we get the US to talk to China properly?
Those are wonderful comments. Tamsin, I want to turn it back to you. Do you have questions, and could you lead the selection of comments from the participants so that we get some of those voices into the room?
Sure, thanks, Michael. And thanks, Ian. And actually, just based on what you were saying, there are 3 questions and one of my own, and I might try and just weave them together. But from Mike, who is the chair of the Impact Trust, and thanks for being here, Mike. He asked, apart from sport and invasions, are countries more of a hindrance than a help in putting the world to rights? Could city, regions, transnational corporates, local and worldwide nonprofits work together to do a better job? So that's his question, but I'd like to add to that. In the book, you talk about the need for resilience based on individual behavior change, and you talk about network problems and network solutions. And of course, being a person who's studying resilience and particularly pushing back on the notion that individual resilience is the thing, that it does hint there at this notion of cooperatism and collective resilience. And I'd be interested in, similar to Mike's question, is how you think systems determining behavior can actually help better choices in terms of individual, because it feels like we're a little bit sort of channeled into the sheep dip. And so how much optionality do we have for individual-based resilience behavior? And I'm going to link that. Sorry, I'm going to link all 3 questions to you, so hopefully that will feed you for a bit. But Amanda, thanks, Amanda. She also says, you talk about progress. And I'd love you to unpack what that word means for you, because if we're looking at these systems, our economic and political thinking that is also driving individual behavior, do we not need a better word or a better way of thinking for growth, economic transformation? And then related to that from Carlos, thank you, was what do you think about basic income as a way of supporting sort of addressing the inequality? So I think they are 4 linked for me. I hope they're linked for you, but it feels like they feed each other.
Yeah.
So thank you. And if there are any other, yeah.
Okay, let me tackle these, and then hopefully there'll be time for another round as well. I see there are quite a few questions. The question from Mike as to whether countries are a help or a hindrance is a very interesting one. I think the answer is that one shouldn't expect countries to be big brother. In other words, if you expect countries to solve problems, you will wait forever, and particularly countries all working together through the United Nations or some body like that. But some countries can play a lead role on some issues, and that's if they are pushed to do so. Countries are not independent of the constituencies that make them up politically, even autocracies. And the question is, what are their priorities and what are they pushing for? And particularly, what are the elites of different types pushing for within these, but not only those vocal voices elsewhere. Most problems can be resolved by coalitions of actors coming together, businesses, cities, states. We saw this, interestingly enough, when Trump refused to sign up to the Paris Agreement. The states and companies and cities that committed constituted well over 75%, 3/4 of emissions in the US, and moved a long way without the federal government being the anchor for those movements. So we've seen the power, and we've seen it on other issues as well. We've seen companies, although there's been an enormous amount of greenwashing, we've seen companies, some companies moving decisively on ESG and in other areas. And in the pandemic, we saw an extremely differential impact of the pandemic on different countries, and trying to work out which countries did well and which countries did badly and why is an interesting thing. And basically, it's not democracy or autocracy. The only factor I've been able to pick up in common is that countries run by women did much better than countries run by men. But certainly, there's a lot of democracies, including the UK, the US, Turkey, Brazil, who really were catastrophic in their handling of the pandemic. And there's also autocracies that were. So coalitions, yes. And for more on this, I would refer you to the Oxford Martin Commission for Future Generations, which is a free download on the Oxford Martin School website. It was chaired by Pascal Lamy, who had just stepped down as the Director General of the World Trade Organization. It had an incredible group of wise people, about 20 of them, including a number of Nobel Prize winners, former leaders, etc. And I basically said to them, I was the deputy chair, you've all got all the scars on your back from trying to do institutional reform, trying to solve problems. Let's go through the world's top 20 problems and think of new ways of addressing them. And the common theme of it is forming coalitions, led with some countries who are prepared to be first movers being there, but not relying on the global institutions, because then you get held up by the slowest movers. So using actors who are prepared to be first movers, building widening circles of consensus, and demonstrating that by working together, you can make a dent on the problem. And then by demonstrating that, more people join you and you make a bigger dent through building your communities and constituencies. So very much a network approach. Tamsin, systems, nudge, and optionality. I agree with you that this is a relationship between individual behavior change, and individuals do need to be resilient, not least, and that's partly goes back to the chapter on mental health, psychologically resilient, because the surprises that we're going to constantly see in our lives are going to challenge us psychologically. And if you get paralyzed by change, you're not well placed for the future. But the same is true of institutions and at other levels. System change is extremely important, but the interaction between it is vital. The basic takeaway is that the more one is in a complex dynamic system, the more one's own individual actions change everything else, and you get impacted by everything else. When you're poor in a village in the middle of nowhere in Africa, what you do doesn't matter to the world. The world matters to you. You get hit by climate change, but you can't change the world. But all of us, through what we say, what we do, what we wear, what we eat, how we fly, everything we do and consume is having a global ripple. And at the same time, we are absorbing information and we are changing the way we are through the world. And that really means that Maggie Thatcher's adage that there's no such thing as society, there's only individuals, is completely wrong. Because individuals are the constituent part of societies. And if you try and act independently of society, you will find that you're not only damaging the lives of everyone else, but you're not benefiting. as a societal member. So system change and its interaction, I think, is vital. I don't believe very much in nudge, which is sort of the soft version of system change, which libertarians like, because the nudge we need is so big that if we're not going to change the system, you're going to end up on the same path. We need something, and the pandemic provided that, which gives us a different system, a different structure. And what the whole book is about is that temporary or is that permanent? Is it are we reverting or are we learning in a significant way? Amanda, progress. Well, I certainly don't measure progress by GDP or economic growth. That's much too narrow. It's useful. It's deeply flawed for multiple reasons. It's one of the many gauges or items on a dashboard that we should be looking at. GDP is very perverse. The worse that the society is, you can also improve GDP by, for example, you break a lot of windows and you need to fix a lot of windows, you increase GDP. Or you have a lot of heart attacks and you need more doctors and nurses, you increase GDP. So GDP is a very perverse measure. You take a lot of oil out of the ground and you cut your forest down, you increase GDP. You destroy the planet and your future. So it's perverse. It's one item to look at. We should look at multiple other items. They're all flawed in different ways. They're all impartial. Happiness indices really don't count for very much. You look at the correlation between happiness indices and, for example, suicide or depression, and it's very surprising how very happy societies can also have very negative health matrices, for example. So I think we should have a dashboard. What is progress? For me, progress is a slightly more intangible thing, and it depends what your value system is. For me, progress is the fact that South Africa is democratic. For me, progress is the fact that Ireland elected a gay prime minister. And when I said to my Irish friends, that's amazing, they sort of said, why is it amazing? It's just obvious. Why wouldn't we do that? You know, it's like a non-issue. That's progress. When things that would have been unthinkable 30 or 40 years ago become so embedded in the way we are. There's progress on multiple fronts, including, I hope, on Alzheimer's and dementia, which when you reach my age, you start worrying more about. But there's lots of progress, and we can measure them on multiple dimensions. Carlos and UBI, or BI, you mentioned. I'm a great believer that we shouldn't allow anyone in our society to starve if we can afford not to, and that everyone should have a basic income. But I'm very against the concept of universal basic income. And it's the word universal, the UBI, which tends to get bundled in with the BI, which I oppose for multiple reasons. The first is that it's just unaffordable. And even for a rich country like the UK, if you gave everyone a living wage, it would be well over the entire budget of the government. The second is that it's often used by libertarians, and it's a weird consensus between the extreme right and left, the libertarians and sort of far left, that they like UBI, that it's a substitute for work, that people are paid to stay at home. And of course, what that leads to, and we know this from all the evidence of the diseases of despair, and Angus Deaton has written a great book about this, about the Midwest of the US, that it leads to people going mad, basically, becoming alcoholic, depressed, suicidal, engaging in crime, a lot of domestic violence, alienation, that we get meaning, we get context, we get networks, we get support, we get skills, we get many things from work. And that the idea that you pay people to stay at home is, I believe, wrong on multiple reasons, but mostly for the people involved. It's also a loss of human capacity in our societies. The third reason I don't like it is that all the evidence suggests it will increase inequality. And the reason for that is that by basically giving everyone the same amount of money, including billionaires, right? That's what the universal means. You give everyone the same amount of money, you give less to those that need it. So you stop all the means tested disbursement of money. That means you stop giving unemployment benefit, child benefit, disability benefit, housing benefit, food benefit, etc., because you're wrapping it up into this universal benefit. That means you give everyone basically less than the poor would have got under a different scheme, if it's going to be affordable. So it increases inequality. And I think it's also ethically wrong, because I don't like the idea of giving billionaires money. And finally, I don't like it is because I think it's a complete cop-out for the conversation we should be having. It tends to be used in the context of machines taking jobs, which I think is a real threat. My group in Oxford says up to half of jobs are vulnerable in the US, for example. So we need to think about this issue, but we need to think about it in terms of, okay, so what will people do? And other ways of structuring things. So should we have a completely different working week? Should we pay much more for creative work? Should we pay for care work and homework that often isn't paid for? What are all the other things we need to be thinking about to ensure that everyone in our society gets paid to work in a fair and equitable way? And UBI is being used by the libertarian right and by the left as basically a blanket to put over this conversation, which isn't happening. And that's another reason I oppose it.
Thank you, Ian.
Ian,
Michael,
we're
I don't-
aware that we are right at the top of the hour, and it's been an extraordinary time with you. I apologize for my tech difficulties, but I'm so glad that I heard, and we all heard this remarkable presentation. As a final quick question, the first is, where can those of us who are interested, and I count myself among those, continue to follow your current thinking? Do you have a website or something else where we can find you? I believe you do.
Yeah.
And the second is, what's your guess about whether we will summon the collective will to put in place the global institutions that we need to move toward a better world?
Yeah, thanks very much, Michael. Yes, I have a website. In fact, Tamsin put it up. It's right at the very beginning of the chat, iangoldin.org, and it also has my Twitter address, which is Ian_Goldin.
Great.
So do
I've
engage
put
on
it in
that
again.
and check it out. That's the easy answer. The more difficult answer to your second question, I have no doubt that we'll get organizational change and a system which is fit for purpose. The only thing I have total doubt about, which I don't know, is whether we're in the First World War or the Second World War, whether we have to be thrown off a cliff again, or whether the pandemic was enough of a wake-up call to get the shift. And I hope desperately, and that's why I wrote the book, that, you know, we all know people that have suffered desperately. Some of us know people that have died. Many of us know people with long COVID. You don't want all that suffering to be in vain. If we can do anything to ensure it doesn't occur again, that this is the wake-up call that humanity needed to shift gears, then I think the onus is on us to do it. And that's why I hope this webinar has been helpful. And I wish you well in all of your work as you go about these tasks.
Ian, thank you so much. Tamsin, last words, and then let's turn it over to Stanley.
Thank you, Michael. I suppose my last words would be thank you, Ian. It's been a fascinating 5 years of knowing you and following a lot of this thinking. And Michael, the Mega Network, I'm so glad to have brought these two thinking groups together, if you like. And I'm just grateful for the time. And thank you, everybody, for joining.
Stanley?
Thank you so much, Ian, Tamsin, Michael. This has been a truly fascinating conversation, and we have much to reflect on. And also thank to all of you for joining us. We appreciate you being here. Want to let you know that a recording for this webinar will be made available on the omega.ngo website. And we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar. If you're interested in receiving more invitations like this, you can register there. Thank you so much again, Ian, and we look forward to seeing you all next time.